So my name is Julia Birks. I'm the Associate Director of Strategic Design at Isobar, and I'm also our capability specialist there. So what that means is I help organizations to, I guess, use design and agile and other practices, frameworks, methodologies, and so on to improve the way they deliver work and the way they collaborate to deliver that work. I also teach at Monash University. So I'm in the entrepreneurship portfolio over there as part of the Monash Business School. And what we do there is I teach undergraduate entrepreneurship. So basically helping students to really understand how a lot of, I guess, human-centered design techniques fit into the business life cycle, and how to actually then take that desirability, take that understanding of humans and customers, and I suppose build something meaningful, viable, feasible, that's actually a sustainable product or service. So a bit of a teaching nerd is the summary. But
Okay.
yeah, teaching and human-centered design.
Okay, that's great. So you help businesses mature their human-centered design practices.
Yeah.
And would you be able to tell us a little bit about what a mature human-centered design practice looks like?
Yeah, so I think part of this is, we need to be careful as human centered designers, not to get too obsessed with what we describe as human centered design. I think that's the first part of viewing human centered design maturity, because there are some great businesses that are doing it, they're just not calling it that. So I think that's the first thing we have to be really cautious about, kind of parking a touch of our, design purism when it comes to assessing organizational capability. And just, full disclaimer, this was something I really struggled with early in my career as well. Um, I really felt like it was important to have rules in how these things were implemented.
Yeah.
But actually, I don't think that's productive. I don't think it's helpful. But for me, a mature human centered design practice is really one that I suppose human centered design is part of how they think. That's probably the simplest way to describe it. It's less of a practice and more of an approach, more of a mindset, more of a, well, of course we solve problems with humans. How else would you solve problems? That's kind of the place we need to get to in society, right? Is that it's no longer about the business. The business is key. Viability and feasibility are key to delivering the great experience, but in terms of that practice, we have to just be, I guess, it's like people always use that term customer obsessed. It sort of sounds a bit like wanky, but yeah, we just have to have, I guess, an alignment to the customer as part of just how we work day to day.
Okay. Yeah. I'm kind of glad you touched on that point of, um, there isn't really a design utopia. You have to work with other business functions, and we all intend to be user-centered in one way or another, but we might go about it in different ways. And I think there's a scale, isn't there, of, you can overdo something, but sometimes you know enough to go in a certain direction and you can figure it out along the way.
Mm,
Um, I,
yeah.
I mentioned to my partner, Lauren, yesterday, we're going to be talking about human-centered design. And she said, "Isn't all design human-centered?" Um, and I kind of stepped back and I had to think about it. And I was thinking, there seems to be like a top-down and a bottom-up approach. You can come in with some good ideas and something you want to do, and you can work through the process that way. But also, you can start with exploration and work upwards, right?
Yeah, no, oh, bless your partner. Isn't she a good optimist? No, it's so funny. I've been with my wife for 10 years now, and I feel really proud that I've trained her to identify what bad UX looks like. So at first it was just me ranting at products in the supermarket or in the department stores, and now she's on board, which I feel personally very proud of. She's
Yeah.
developed a nuanced critique of usability. Um, yeah, look, I think, I don't know, I'm kind of old school, right? Like, I mean, one of the things I love about being a human-centered design practitioner is making everybody else the expert. Like, I think, a friend of mine named Paul Blake, who runs a small studio, he hired me into my first UX job, and he's a bloody brilliant genius. And he told me this story from about, like, I think it was the late 90s when he first when he first worked in UX for Transport for London. And so he got hired by the marketing leader, and he goes into the marketing leader's office. Sorry, people are just madly, I'll start
That's
that
okay.
sentence. I'm just going to turn off all my notifications. God, that is peak 2020, 2021, isn't it?
It is.
Oh, God. So I'll start that again. So I remember when, my colleague told me he first got hired by Transport for London, and he'd been hired by, I think, like the marketing manager there, which, really shows you how far UX has come in 15, 20 years. And the marketing manager, he goes into the marketing manager's office on like week one, after he's been sniffing around TFL. And he says, okay, I need some budget for customer experience research, like for design research. And the marketing manager goes, well, why would you need to do research? That's why I hired you. You're the expert. And he says, well, no, I'm not the expert. The customer is the expert.
Yeah.
And I think, when you talk about top down and bottom up, I think it's sort of like, for decades, success in organizations has been driven by this idea that you succeed by being the smartest person in the room.
Mm-hmm.
And culturally, that's a massive shift. Like that is, when we think about how connected most people are, well, it's certainly in a lot of the work we do, how connected a lot of people are to, or how connected their sense of identity is to work. And then you're telling them not to be the expert, especially senior leaders. You can understand why it's really, really like stressful and disconcerting to go through a human-centered design change, like a transformation, or bring these practices in, because you're saying, hey, so pretty much for the rest of your career, you're no longer the expert, right? Or your expertise needs to shift.
Yeah.
And so in terms of the top-down sort of approach, I guess they're the sort of things that I'm thinking about is, how do you reassure leaders that it's going to be okay? Like that this is going to actually make stuff better for you. And you're going to have to shift the way you think about leadership, right? But it's there. And then from the bottom up approach, for me, I think actually a lot of it is the same challenges.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's, I don't know. I've always been okay with ambiguity because I'm like a weird, creative, queer nerd with ADHD. So like to me, new things are really like literally part of how my brain works. But
Mm-hmm.
I know for a lot of people that ambiguity is really discomforting.
Yeah, it's kind of contrary to everything else you've ever learned, where you go to school, you go to university, and you're taught that there's a specific way to do things, there's a process, and you know what you're going to get at the end of the process. Whereas design is like, I have an idea of the goals, and now I just need to go into it and figure it out. And I think you confront what you touched on earlier, like you confront this idea of the archetypal designer that is the creative genius that goes away and comes back with something amazing. Whereas actually it's more, you're an observer and you're a facilitator, and often you're more quiet than you are talking. And I think that's a huge shift.
Yes. Yeah. And, I think in terms of how we can support human-centered design change in organizations, part of what we can do is actually really reassurance and humility, So what I mean by that is, I teach human-centered design. I have for years. I've done, dozens and dozens of projects with literally thousands of users. Literally this year, I still had that moment where I was like, oh God, I have to trust the process. It's uncomfortable, like even after a very long time in the design industry, I still feel that way.
Yeah.
And I think that's good because it means we care, right? That discomfort is like, we want to produce a good outcome, but we just have to like have a really great level of self-awareness and reassure people that discomfort is actually normal. The discomfort is part of the process, but it's trusting that if we take that human-centered approach, the answers will become apparent. Once we have the right amount of information, we've done the right amount of discovery, we will have the right information we need to make the right decisions. Or at least to start in the right direction is probably a better way to say it.
Yeah. I've personally always found it a lot harder to sell an exploratory discover process. It's a lot easier to say, here's something I drew quickly, this is what we want to build. and because you can forecast and project and have an idea of what the earnings might be or something like that. But do you typically find it a tough sell when you first go in?
Well, yes and no. Like, it depends, right? I mean, so in the work I'm in now, so I'm a strategic designer. And so by the nature of what I do, we're applying design thinking or human-centered design as strategy, to define the strategic direction of a business or a part of the business or whatever. So I think just in that nature, people already know I'm a bit weird, or we're a bit weird. We're a bit different. We're not the typical UX designer. And I mean, I'm usually these days, the level of maturity around strategic design at Isobus certainly has really increased, so that all of our CEDs, our client engagement directors, our client management team, basically, all of them know how to go, when is this a strategic problem versus a delivery problem? And that's when we get involved. But honestly, I think it's really easy to these days to, I guess, demonstrate why discovery matters. And it's a simple case of risk, right? Like, most businesses are risk averse. They know that high risk costs money potentially, and wastes time and does brand damage and, makes them look bad. So I leverage risk. That's my number one conversation piece is, I can design you whatever you want. Like, at the end of the day, if you want me to design your website or a service or portal or whatever, I can do that. That's fine. Just give me the thing and I'll do it. But tell me how you know that this is the right thing to build. Tell me what problem this is solving for your customers, and if they can show me evidence for that, cool. But if they don't have evidence for that, my question is always, well, shouldn't we go and find out if we're solving the right thing and reduce that risk? And, like you mentioned this idea earlier of a continuum, which I love because I love a good continuum. So I'm really passionate about this idea of a continuum of change, which I think exists whether you're shifting to human-centered design, to agile, whatever it is. People often think of change as binary, like you are human-centered or you're not, you're agile or you're not, you're fit or you're not fit. Like, it applies in all aspects of our life, right? We tend to see it as an on or off switch, and it's just not how human beings work. Change is such a journey. And so I tend to think of one end of the continuum as being like, our context, where we are right now, and the other end of the continuum as being where we want to go, or in my case as a consultant, where do I want to nudge my clients? And I think then our role is to understand that change takes time, like years, not months, and that our job is to nudge the organization in the direction that they need to go, and to reassure them that that's going to be good for business, and to reassure them that missteps are part of that, but we learn from the missteps, and that's the most important thing.
Okay, so you mentioned then that the CED will identify if it's a technical or a strategic solution that is required. So are you then coming in during a project and then leading by example on a specific aspect of that project to lift the capability?
Yeah, generally speaking, I mean, that's the approach I take, because I think that develops better outcomes. Probably make a lot of people unhappy with my next statement, but I kind of don't care. I really don't like the consulting model of embedded practitioners. I really dislike it. It feels really predatory to me, and it feels really patronizing. And I'm really sorry to those organizations, but I'm never going to work in that way, because I believe the most value that we can provide to clients and to our organizations is the further distribution of our ideas, and to build the confidence of practicing these ideas in the people around us. Because, for those of us that have been in the human-centered design industry for long enough, we know you can't fight that battle yourself. Yeah, it has to be a team sport, and to make it a successful team sport, you have to be comfortable with letting people try the things that you could probably do much better than them, but to support them and empower them to go, hey, you got this, you can do this. Let's now reflect on how you did here's the areas you can improve, but gosh, you did this really well. So it's about, changing the human, not just changing the process.
Yeah.
And I think that is like, that to me is the most important thing. It's like, how can we give people that confidence?
Yeah. Sounds like recruiting advocates that are close to you to then kind of expand outwards.
Yeah. And like people have a lot of trauma around change as well, right? Like I did a hackathon with an organization. I'm trying to remember what they were called. Oh, Geek Girl Academy, maybe. I feel terrible. I have to add a link later so that I don't forget.
Yeah.
But they're fantastic. They're an organization that seeks to get women into coding and into games design. So they ran a hackathon a couple of years ago, and basically what you had to do was to build an entire video game in a weekend. And it was really fun, actually. And I thought I'd applied to be a designer, but it turns out I'd applied to be a project manager. That's how I ended up project managing my first video game. And what happened along the way was I had my friend actually got put on the same team as me. Her name's Shu. She's an amazing designer. And then we had this other woman named Celia, who was our programmer and was just learning to program. And I sort of said to her, look, we're gonna run this project agile. And I've never seen anyone make a like fuck off face more than I've seen Celia make this face. And I was like, oh, I can see you've got a bit of anxiety around agile, like, not trying to suppress. I was just like, hey, tell me about that. And she told me about a particular Big Four consultancy that had come into her organization to deliver change, and it had been a complete mess, and it had been a terrible experience, and she really hated it. And I was like, you know what? It's not the first time I've heard that. Agile can be really stressful for people, but we're going to use this thing called Kanban. And, I'd love if you just give it a go. And if you hate it after half a day, let's scrap it and try something different. And she was like, okay, cool. So we built this little Kanban board. I, being the nerd I am, had brought, wads of super sticky Post-its and Sharpies with me. And we basically made this little Kanban backlog on this pillar next to the table where we were assigned to work. And so we just had our, to-do list, a WIP limit of 1 on each of the team members on our doing, and then our done column. And we would literally reprioritize that Kanban like every hour. As they would code some stuff and be like, oh, that's not working. It'd be like, okay, do we need to scratch this feature and build this instead? And by the end of that weekend, Celia was like, Agile's great actually when it's done well. And I'm like, isn't it? And I think that's a really wonderful story. I'm getting teary. I get teary when I get excited. It's such a dorky thing. I was so proud of that moment, because it can't be around forcing people. You can't make people change. They have to believe in it, and they have to feel part of it, and they have to feel like they have control. And we have to talk about the human element of that, because it's, all the things we do and that we deliver come back to people. We're delivering value for customers with staff who are humans. So, yeah.
It sounded like the difference between your approach and the consultancy's approach was that you decided to work with the people, and it sounds like they decided to tell the people how to work, which perhaps isn't going to go down so well.
Yeah, and I think, again, people think of things like human-centered design and agile and so on as processes, and it's about the process, and none of it is about the process. Okay, that's an overstatement. Of course the process matters, but the bulk of it is actually the mindset. It's winning those minds and getting people to believe in the value and how this makes their work better, and to get them to believe that they can build the skills needed to deliver better value to customers. To love their job, because god damn it, human-centered design is just more fun, I think.
It's good fun.
Biased.
The creative process in general, like wherever you're applying it, I just think it's amazing. So when you go onto a client project or into a new organization, or perhaps someone that you haven't worked with before, What kind of things are you looking for as a starting point?
It's from the very first day, I'm trying to figure out where they're at.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm trying to figure out what have they done in the past that I can leverage. And to be honest, it's like, oh, this is so sneaky. I'm going to confess this on camera. I think a lot of what we do as consultants is loving manipulation, which sounds evil, right? Like it sounds really evil, but I certainly don't mean it in an evil way. I mean it like, if you go back to that change continuum, and we're trying to get them from where they are now to a better, future, better outcomes, right? We're trying to understand what have they done that I can praise them for and be like, oh, what a great job you did with that, usability testing over there. How fantastic. Like how can I build them up and get them, to believe in the behaviors they've already done?
Mm-hmm.
And then how can I kind of start laying the foundations for the ramping up of that? Yeah. So I'll give you an example. I did a project, a big strategic design piece with a healthcare client this year. And we're basically brought on to understand like how would health fit into the future of how their service was delivered, which sounds hilarious for a healthcare company, but it is what it is. And my goal, knowing that they weren't doing a huge amount of experimentation at the start, our client team and our leaders had sort of told me that before I went on the project. My goal was like, okay, they're going to finish this project believing that co-design, validation, and experimentation are the future. That was my little goal. So literally the first meeting I had, I was like just starting to normalize it, from the very first day. I'm not waiting till the end of the project to normalize it. First meeting, I'm like, yeah. And so, we're going to go through the project like this. And then once we get to this point, of course, we're going to do validation with staff and customers, and just treating that like it was the most normal thing in the world. And yep, we can talk about that client when we get there and how that will work, but that's where we're going. That's where, don't stress about that now. We'll come back to it. And every couple of times I'd talk with them, I'd just link it back to that. Yeah. I'd find a way to be like, and as we move forward, how we'll feel confident in the direction is because we will have done those co-design sessions. So it's like you're just planting the little seeds, or you're building the breadcrumb trail, or whatever cute analogy you want to go for. Don't wait till you're there. You've got to start up front and almost think strategically about how do you want to shift them down that continuum? What's the little mini goal you're setting for yourself? Yeah. I think the other part of that too is sometimes, another approach is not asking for permission. Mm-hmm. So, probably like 5 years ago, a bank was one of my big clients, and we're doing like a 10-month project to redesign the home loan experience digitally. And they'd given us budget for one round of usability testing, like I think 8 months into the 10-month project or whatever. And I was like, well, that's not a very useful time to find out if we're on the right track. Yeah. So literally in like week 3 of the project, I just sort of said to my colleague, hey, what if we just found some people across the business and across their business who've recently applied for a home loan and just tested some crappy prototypes? And she was like, heck yeah. And so we did it. And we actually did variant testing, A/B variant testing on the sequencing of the application process. And what was great was we were able to show the client the kind of way they'd been approaching the collection of certain data wasn't really holding up conceptually for customers. So, at the end of the day, though, I don't care if the customer's idea wins or the client's idea wins. If my idea wins, whatever, I actually don't care. I care about good outcomes. Mm-hmm. So, all I care about is that I get the opportunity to validate.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
There's some great tips. I'm just going to recap because there's some good ones there. So some conditioning to highlight what's worked well in the past, I guess, as a way to shift their mind state into a positive area, right? Where they believe that they're already kind of on the track. It's just you're just clearing the way a little bit. And then there's highlighting a bit of a framework. So here are the phases that you go through. So, or a bit of a roadmap for how the project might run so that they know what to expect. And then I think don't ask for permission is a great one, because if you're asking for permission from people that may not have had the exposure to the things that you've had, then it's going to be a really tough sell, isn't it, to get that support? Whereas demonstrating and showing it, and then when they see the results of the user tests or perhaps the videos, that's, I think, when they're sold, isn't it, if it's gone well.
Mm.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that's it. Like budget limitations. I get it; they're real. I think a lot of people think that because Isobar is an agency, we have big agency bucks, and we run pretty lean, and a lot of our clients run pretty lean. Because we want to provide value. We don't have a huge amount of fat built into stuff, and so it's challenging sometimes when you want to do that research and you don't have the budget. But for me, the way I always think about it is, how could I make this work? I remember my first line manager at my first UX job, this brilliant guy named Mike Floyd, who's like one of the OGs in Australia of UX and human-centered design. He's a great guy. He said to me, Julia, some UX is always better than no UX, and that's really stuck with me, because it fits into that idea of the continuum too. Mm-hmm. It's like, are we doing the perfect project with all the UX we could possibly dream of? Well, aren't we just so greedy that it would never be enough? So I think it's not that approach. The approach is, okay, what do we need to know? What do we have to work with? What can we try and make a case to get the funding we need? But if we can't get it, what can we do with the time we have? How can we nudge it a little bit further down the continuum on this project? And when I would work with big organizations like banks and stuff, and I'd have multiple clients within the same organization, one of the things that I would do with love, again, feels a little bit manipulative, but with love, is almost like use the last stakeholder to kind of G up the next stakeholder. So I'd be like, oh, we did this amazing project for this person in this department. And, we just did this little bit of research and it worked really well. And here's the differences it made. So, if we're doing this project for you, why don't we just, add this extra step that will really, really help you to feel confident and reduce risk in this part of the process. And, so I kind of also then use these layers of change across the organization to sort of shift people where I wanted them to go. And it worked reasonably well, actually. So, yeah.
Bringing some social proof.
Solving.
Yeah. I had a similar experience early on, actually, where I picked up a project. I knew I needed to do some research. And I remember thinking, I'm not sure what questions I need to ask. Should we go ahead with the research? And somebody just said, it's always better to speak to customers than not speak to customers. But at the same time, you don't want to be wasting resources, right? You've got to be trying to ask those really salient questions, keep it high level, and find your way from there.
I love the idea of user research or customer research as storytelling. Like, when I teach this stuff, the first thing I always teach people when you're doing discovery research is the old, tell me about the last time you did the thing in the context that I want to understand. And just let them talk about it and ask them, oh, tell me more about that. Why is that? What was the reason you chose to do that? And, honestly, I'm very bad at keeping research sessions to time. But with that approach, I think you can keep it as a conversation. And make people feel safe and put them in the driver's seat from the get-go and get great results.
Yeah. So it's one of my favorite questions. Tell me about anything, starting with tell me about. You always learn something new. It's enlightening. Mm-hmm. Do you find that the clients that you work with, are there recurring challenges that you see them facing?
Yeah, definitely. Every organization's different, but there's a few themes that pop up. Probably the biggest one is leaders not thinking they need to change, bless their cotton socks. This is really common, right? Like, it's that kind of old school hierarchical top-down change approach where I think leaders presume the change is being done to the rest of the organization and not to us. Yeah. So, and I think probably the other thing I see is people thinking that the human-centered design process only applies to customer work. So they're sort of intertwined, right? Because leaders often aren't the ones designing for the customers. They're actually designing for the staff.
Yeah.
But rarely do they take the same principles that we're learning and apply them to their staff and have a curious mindset and discovery and ask questions. You know, I know we spoke in the past, Jack, about this idea of flexible working. And, you know, at Isobar, we've implemented flexible working, you know, permanently now. It's now our policy at Isobar and at our parent company, Dentsu. And how that was decided was with the staff. You know, our CEO, Ange Tangus, who is just fucking awesome, if I can swear, which, you know, I will. She's amazing. And she sort of just took a human-centered approach to understanding what people wanted and actually used that insight to then figure out how we would redesign the office space for when people return to work. So, you know, it was human-centered around, well, how often do you want to be in the office? You know, what do you want to do when you're in the office? What's the purpose of that space for you? You know, and what do you need to do the work that you need to do in the office? So, yeah, and that I think is a really great example of human-centered leadership, because not only are you producing better outcomes for your staff, you're also modeling the exact behaviors you want them to use to deliver better value for customers. So you're uplifting the organization in multiple ways.
Yeah. I think to draw an analogy to human-centered design to the creative process in general, like in anything that you do, I think it's about removing yourself from the equation and working with the world and the things that you see and what's out there and trying to do something with that, as opposed to taking something in here and just forcing it out on the world. Whenever you do that, you meet resistance and it's difficult.
Yeah. Are you familiar with the concept of lean change, Jack?
No.
Oh, it's a fantastic concept. I believe Jason Little was the person who founded it, or at least he was the first person to write a book about it. But it's basically exactly that. You know, it's looking at that sort of antiquated notion of, you know, oh, well, we're going to have a Gantt chart and we're going to map out and then this will be delivered here and this will be delivered here, which of course never works, right? Because at the center of all of this are humans who are emotional. I remember reading an article years ago about like the psychological impacts of a desk move. Like there's like a desk move impacts something like 6 parts of your fundamental identity. And if a desk move does that, imagine how much, you know, a new change program, a new way of working, a new way of thinking about your role in the organization. Imagine the impact that has on your sense of identity and sense of confidence and self, you know. So of course these little Gantt chart, like waterfall style change programs don't work and don't work well and actually traumatize people along the way. And I don't use that word lightly because I've heard some pretty awful stories in my career about the impact of these kinds of change. Whereas what lean change says is think about, like, set the vision, set the ambition you want to work towards. Think about what do you think is the most important thing, and usually get inputs from your staff to understand where they're at right now and what they're struggling with and where they want to go. And then figure out, cool, what's an experiment I could run as a leader to try and shift the culture towards that vision. You know, so it's actually taking those human-centered design, lean startup ideas and applying them to a change management process. And it's a fantastic way, because then at the end of each experiment, you look at the measurements and go, okay, what worked? What didn't work? What did we learn? What do we do next?
Yeah, it feels like the difference between having a micromanager and having a supportive manager. Where a micromanager is generally just someone that just doesn't trust anyone but themselves, so they prescribe everything and creates all this resistance, and it pressures you into a certain way of being. And then as a human being micromanaged, you're going to react, it's not going to go so well. But then the other side is, I trust, I understand the process, maybe I'm a more secure person, and kind of take a more supportive approach.
Oh no, I'm a massive fan of servant leadership. You might have deduced from the Disney castle and the Disney t-shirt that I'm a little bit of a Disney fan. And this was just hilarious coincidence, actually. I totally forgot that this was my background before our chat this morning. But I went to Disney in 2016 with my wife and some friends, and whilst they were off enjoying the Magic Kingdom, I, being the nerd I was, paid an extreme amount of money to do a 7-hour or 8-hour backstage tour of all of Disney World. So nothing like understanding the utility or corridors to know like how Magic a Park. I loved every minute of it. And we had these wonderful leaders from Disney Imagineering taking us through the park. And, it's definitely directed at the tourist lens, but of course I'm the nerd there going like, tell me about the management approach to delivery. And so I was sitting at this all you care to enjoy buffet over lunch at one of their hotels, and we're sitting with these Disney leaders, and I said to them, how do you manage your people? How do you get great outcomes from your teams? And he talked about servant leadership. It was the first time I'd ever heard this concept of servant leadership. And it's basically this idea, to sort of your point, Jack, of turning up to work every day and saying to your people, how can I help you? And I love that. That's such, imagine if all leaders did that and actually put their people first. Because, the funny thing I found about applying it is when you apply servant leadership, at first your workload goes up exponentially because you've not been practicing servant leadership. You've been putting your people last. You've been pushing back one-on-ones. You've been doing all this stuff. But when you actually go, how can I help you? You've got a whole bunch of new things you need to do in the short term, but in the long term, you're actually building your people up to be self-reliant, to ask for help when they need it, to make them feel supported. And it's such a wonderful gift for yourself and for your team. So I love it.
It
I'm
is.
a fan of change.
Yeah, I agree. I think if you're as a leader, you're able to set clear goals and aspirations, then the rest of your role is just about enabling people. And I think a lot of the time that also means just getting out of the way.
Yes, I was literally just thinking that as you said it. I'm just thinking you have to get the hell out of their way.
Yeah, you've hired the person to do the job. If you've given them a clear enough set of goals, just get out of the way, trust them, check in every now and then.
Yeah, and it requires, like you say, that trust. Like, trust is such a key part of it. And that's scary, especially if you've been incentivized to control.
Yeah.
But if you can build, people that think about solving problems in the right way, in the right mindset, there'll be bumps along the road. There always are. But, you're teaching those people to be self-serving ultimately, which is what you want, right? It's how you grow people faster. It's not by, it's such a dorky adage, but that old teaching people how to fish, right? Like,
yeah. And it makes your job easier in the end.
Exactly.
Okay. So before we wrap up, do you have any tips for people that might want to reflect on their own practice and make some improvements?
Do you mean human-centered design practice or like cultural change practice? Where are you thinking?
I think human-centered design.
Cool. Okay. So, oh gosh, there's a lot. I think the first thing is to come back to that mindset. Like, understand that how you think is more important than what you think or what you know. So, really lean into that mindset. And there's so many, frameworks. Everybody's got a framework for human-centered design. There's the double diamond. I've seen this thing called the squid, which is just terrifying.
I've not seen that one.
Oh God, it just makes me want to cry.
I'll have a Google.
There's the old, what is it? Design, iterate, I don't know. Like, I should know them all, and they're all just variations on a theme.
They're all the same. Yeah.
It's understand the problem, try a thing, learn from it, do it all again.
Yeah.
So understand that mindset will set you free as a person who solves problem for people.
Yeah.
And then I think it's like, start trying. So if people are at the beginning of building human-centered design within themselves, within their team, within their organization, just start small. You know, think about if you're at the start of that continuum, what's one thing you can do to nudge you to the next step? Is it to run some discovery research? You know, is it to run some usability testing? And I think one of the joys for me in this last year of 2020 just hellscape was seeing the Victorian government increase the rapidity of how they deliver value to the citizens of Victoria. And I'm so sorry about my throat. Just give me a sec.
That's okay.
Cool. Okay. So it was one of the thrills of 2020 was seeing how the Victorian government increased the speed of the delivery of value to Victorian citizens. And there's a super amazing human called Mathan Ratnam, who is leading up a lot of the human-centered design capability at the Department of Premier and Cabinet. And he's ex-Civic, which was a startup lab for Victoria. You know, he's a super experienced human. And they've built a whole online playbook on the Victorian government website, which has basically like a how-to guide for human-centered design and design thinking. So, you know, it's got everything from like, how do you budget for this in your policies? Like, you know, if you need to understand what customers need, what are the sorts of tools you can use? If you need to test a thing and improve it, how do you do that? If you need to write human-centered policy, how do you do that? And so they're doing a really good job at creating publicly accessible toolkits, and they're really practical. They've got like templates and guides and references, and it's just super smart. So that would be, I think, a really great, you know, portal, especially for Australians, because a lot of the stuff I think is centered on US markets, US budgets, all that kind of thing. So great work to Mathan and the team. They're doing amazing work. So they're probably the first two bits. I think the second two bits, or the second few bits, so technical, is to understand what are the things that then support all of this to be successful. So, you know, you asked earlier, Jack, what are the common mistakes you see? And one of the other things that I haven't mentioned yet is an absence of psychological safety. So psychological safety is essentially this concept that people feel safe enough in their teams to take risks and to make mistakes and to be supported. And it's probably one of the things most absent from Australian workplaces. People call not only human-centered design, but things like psychological safety or, you know, workplace relations as like the fluffy stuff.
Yeah.
And it makes me so mad. And I can't tell you the number of times someone said that to me and I've been like, actually, it's not the fluffy stuff. It's one of the critical components of successfully delivering value, because if you don't have trust and the confidence that you can make a mistake and not be ridiculed or blamed or whatever for it, you are never going to try anything innovative. You're never going to try new ways to deliver value because you're terrified of what the outcomes will be. And that doesn't have to be literal terror. That's often all those little pervasive blockers that organizations put up. You know, it's like, oh, but that won't align with my KPIs, or, you know, that will be extra work for me, or that's not included in the costings or whatever. And so, you know, part of what leaders need to do and what people need to do to enable human-centered design to flourish is to actually look at the things that are blocking people, you know, and one of those things is that psychological safety. How do we build that trust? How do we encourage people to take risks? So there's a great article by, I think it's the New York Times, about Google's Project Aristotle, where they went into the science of all of this and you know, why psychological safety is the number one most important factor in a high-performing team. Mm-hmm. And the other thing I'd add to that is radical candor. So very, very smart woman named Kim Scott founded this concept of radical candor. And it's basically this idea of promoting better feedback in organizations, right? So if you don't have a basis of good feedback, you can't actually have the psychological safety needed to critique other people's work in a kind way. So what Radical Candor says as a concept is we need to give feedback because it demonstrates that we care personally if we do it in a kind way. And we need to challenge people directly. That doesn't mean being a douchebag. Kim Scott calls that obnoxious aggression.
Yeah.
But we need to find ways to give better quality feedback, because I think sometimes it's like we do this thing, particularly in Australian workplaces, we want to lift everybody up, which is wonderful, but doesn't always lead to great outcomes and great value for our customers or our users.
Mm-hmm.
We need to be able to have radically candid conversations about, oh, I love your thinking there. What was the decision? What led to that decision? Why did you choose that approach? Oh, you haven't done research. Cool, you need to do research. Or, hey, I'm not sure if you realized that when you spoke over Jamie in that meeting, it had this impact on their confidence, and they're not confident in sharing ideas. And so just keep that in mind for next time. It's about how do we just make feedback more normal, more human, more kind and regular. So you're not waiting till a bloody performance review a year from now when nothing is relevant to actually remind people the kinds of behaviors they should be practicing. Yeah. So even though it feels quite separate from human-centered design, all of these things for me are connected.
Yeah, I think so. I think those things, they all just enable that flow of ideas and the building of like sensible relationships that allow you to flourish. The psychological safety one resonates with me quite a lot because I think everybody would say that they create a supportive environment. Mm-hmm. At the same time, when you're incentivizing individuals to progress and you're in a room with all of your colleagues and you're being judged on the quality of your ideas, like it's really difficult to kind of let that flow. And I think even to give radical candor, you need the psychological safety in place, right? You need to know that it will be received. Yeah.
Yeah, they're so interdependent, I think. And it's sort of interesting because I think a lot of people mistake niceness for psychological safety.
Yeah.
And niceness is important in a workplace. Absolutely, it's important. But that doesn't mean that there's a presence of trust to be vulnerable, to put forward stupid ideas or that kind of thing. Like I actually, to this day, I did it yesterday at a meeting with a bunch of my team. I was like, I've got an idea. It might be a terrible idea, but I'm going to put it out there because there's no bad ideas in brainstorming, and that's my way of acknowledging, I'm scared that this might come across as stupid, but I'm going to push through that discomfort and do it anyway, because that team, I have great psychological safety with that team. So if I have that awareness and I have a great team, imagine how much harder it is for people who don't have that awareness and have a team where competitive behaviors rather than collective behaviors are encouraged. So I guess the systems thinker within me just sees all of this as part of the workplace ecosystem that we have to foster, because you can't just insert one piece like a module and go, yep, cool, we've got that human-centered design thing sorted. It has to be like, cool, we've got human-centered design, we're introducing these mindsets. What else needs to exist to complement, and I guess like if I was to kind of finish on a, I don't know, hopefully deep thought, it's like, you can't get freaked out again about that continuum. You're not going to get to your ambition overnight. You have to see it as, I guess the collectiveness of a whole bunch of little actions and changes, like you're scaling up over time. And I think that's kind of, if you're trying to bring these practices into your organization, that's the best way to think about it. What are the little actions you do every day that over time add up to big outcomes?
It's a great thought to finish on. Some amazing tips there.
No worries.
So thanks for your time, Julia. That's super insightful. There's loads there.
Fantastic. It was such a pleasure. And I'm just a nerd for this stuff, aren't I? So I really, really love helping others to grow. So it's a real pleasure to have been able to chat with you, Jack. And I hope your listeners get a lot out of it.